Welcome everyone to the webinar today. We'll slowly let everybody to come in. We'll start in a moment. Welcome everyone to the Executive Insights webinar today. My name's Louise Broekman. I'm the founder and CEO of the Advisory Board Centre. I have two very special guests here today to join me, Michael Burke and James Gillard. Might hand over to both of you, give you a quick 30 seconds, a bit about you. So I'll start with you, Michael. Welcome.
Thanks, Louise. I'm the head of strategy and optimisation at Beyond Advisors. So I work in the SME space and work with quite a large number of businesses from, I guess, the one-on-one mentoring through to advisory boards. I think I'm sitting on about 16 of those engagements. So lots of conversations around the topic today. We more broadly support our clients with some of the other, we have an industrial mathematics person there who sort of helps me out a bit when they need a bit more help. But primarily my business these days is working with boards and our individual CEOs, entrepreneurs.
Terrific, good to have you here, and looking forward to having a conversation around market rates, Michael. And welcome, James.
Good morning, and thanks, Louise. Thanks for the opportunity of participating in the seminar today. We've been involved with Advisory Board and Louise right from actually day one, and possibly even before that. As a result of that, we've tended to be able to keep an eye on what Advisory Board and how the market's evolving, and to be able to adapt some insurance products around the professional indemnity public liability for the Advisory Board members. But further to that, as we know, many of the Advisory Board members are going on to bigger and better things such as consulting and the like, and we're trying to work with them to adapt products that suit their needs. So I'll have a little bit of a chat about the insurance market a little bit later, but hopefully enough, everybody will gain a lot out of today from Louise, Michael and myself. Thanks, Louise.
Thanks, James. Always good to have different perspectives around this topic of which we'll do today. So for our attendees, as you are well versed with webinars these days, any questions that you have, please add it into the Q&A box. I'll be going through the advisory engagement and rates report results, the key results in the first instance. And then I'll get perspectives from both Michael and James, and then we'll go to the questions that you've asked, and we'll hopefully get to those as soon as we possibly can, to keep it as interactive with you as we possibly can do. So I'd like to welcome our Advisory Board Centre members from all around the world. I know some of you gather together, or you gather with your network or with clients, watch this webinar together, and then have conversations afterwards with a cup of tea, if it's in the morning, or a glass of red wine in the evening. But it's great to be able to see these communities forming around these particular topics. So I welcome you, and I welcome also your guests that you have with you today. Also like to welcome the broader community that are not members of the Advisory Board Centre, that are really deeply interested in this space. So welcome to you as well. I'll just provide a cap on the Advisory Board Centre itself. The Advisory Board Centre is the global professional body for the advisory board sector. It's about raising the standard of the sector. So we're really driving value for professionals and the organisations they serve. We have the credential, which is the cornerstone to the advisory board profession, which is the Certified Chair program. And then we have about 40 hours of professional development available for our members on an annual basis. We operate in over 20 countries. We have about 500 members that are carefully curated as part of this community. And we've now supported well over 1,000 businesses in the last 3 years in building their advisory boards as a free service. and our work is around professional development as well as advocacy work through our Best Practice and Ethics Advisory Board. The State of the Market report that was released last year, we release it once every 2 years, was just this week reflected by both Korn Ferry and Financial Times as the next big trend for governance. So I really appreciate, the big global brands really recognising the research, and they reference the State of the Market research, but also the evolution of the advisory board sector. One of the key evolutions of those that have seen the State of the Market report is the actual growth of the sector itself. Between 2019 and 2021, it grew over 52% in those 2 years. The key markets where advisory board professionals are in the UK and Europe, and also America. And the Advisory Board Centre provides support for professionals globally. This level of growth means that best practices become more important than ever has before, and keeping an eye on what good looks like and what the key trends are to inform the sector on as it continues to mature is what we're going to be talking about today. So the Advisory Engagement and Rates Report is a members-only report where you get the detail where there's 9 sections around what's going on in the advisory board sector with regards to the way that people are engaging with the market and also their rates. I'll be covering off on key highlights of that report, but members, please download the report that's on Advisory Board World, your interactive platform, to get the latest trends. I know, Michael, you refer to the report on an annual basis to get a bit of a line of sight what's going on in the market.
Yes, no, absolutely. It's I find it just as much as anything to give you the confidence that you're in the right ballpark. Pricing sometimes can be a bit of an uncomfortable conversation for some. It gives you that confidence to know that you're in the ballpark when you're talking to clients, and also to give them some guidelines around what to expect.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. We use this report and its feedback from the advisory board community, both quantitative and qualitative data that we collect on an annual basis to keep an eye on market trends around the world around advisors. It's not about price fixing. It's about really informing the market and informing advisory board professionals of how they are positioning themselves in the market. Just want to make sure that do your own due diligence with regards to your own rates, and we'll talk about how to do your own due diligence about your own rates as well. We'll look at market rate analysis in the first instance. For the report from 2021 and 2022, the most common rate has not changed. So the most common rate still is sitting around, for a half day, around $2,000 in Australian terms. And the range is sitting most commonly between $2,000 to $3,500 in Australian dollars, New Zealand dollars, Singapore dollars. In the US, the range is between 1,500 and 5,000, so there's greater variability in the data that's being collected. For corporatised advisory boards, that means that any advisory board that's sitting within an organisation that has a well-formed governance structure and they have advisory boards as part of their ecosystem, generally the rates for advisory board professionals is either double the business rate or nothing. So it almost sounds like a gambling sort of term, double or nothing. So you get those that are expecting those in a corporatised environment to do it for free or pro bono, and for others that are going into more specialised areas where the rates double the amount that would be in the business sector. The business sector, when we define it, is generally businesses between $1.5 million to $100 million in turnover revenue, and that rate of that $2,000 really relates a lot to the smaller end of the market, because that's where the most of our data is being gathered today. When we're looking at the most common structure for advisory boards, being an independent chair that will work with a business for 3 months up front, generally, then 2 external advisors that will meet with the business on a quarterly basis, maybe 6 times a year, with 2 internal representatives, means that when we're looking at the business market, their investment in their first year is generally between $40,000 to $70,000 for their first year. After that, their advisory board may change up, may change down, but generally that is the kind of rates that we inform the market of what to expect in the business sector. We look at the portfolio of advisory board professionals. What we're finding in the market today is that portfolio professionals have advisory boards as well as other things in their portfolio, as well as doing pro bono. We find that in a broad portfolio, that advisory board professionals generally have about 25% of their work as being pro bono. That's a lot to be giving away. So in some ways, it reflects on the recruitment of advisory board professionals that we know that there's a high spirit of people wanting to give back and make a difference for other people. And so that continues in the way that they end up working when they're building their portfolio. But it's also a very high number in the amount of time that people are giving away. Where people are giving their time away is in three areas: governance boards, advisory boards, and mentoring. And mentoring is the largest avenue that people have in providing free services. So 55% of pro bono work in total is in mentoring. And that way, I think we see the alignment between mentoring and advisory work. They're very closely aligned in the market. But also where the market may start buying advisory services first is through an advisory board of one of mentoring, and then moving into a formalised advisory board over time. So it's just a very interesting number, and one that I'm really keen to watch over the longer term as the advisory board sector continues to mature. The number of engagements that people have in their portfolio ranges from having 1 gig through to 16 engagements. But the most common portfolio arrangement is having 6 engagements at any given time. That's a bit of a shift from last year. It was 5.5, and it may be reflected in the data where we have a high representation of people working in with the small and medium-sized business sector. So the smaller the business, they may have more capacity to service more. But I think the size between 5 to 6 engagements for an individual, not as a business, not when advisory boards is included in the business package, but as an individual, that's about where the market is at the moment. As a percentage of total portfolio that is advisory boards, 53% of advisory board professionals have advisory boards, that's being less than 50% of their portfolio. 37% of them have over 50% of their portfolio being advisory boards, and we've got 10% advisory board professionals that's all they do is advisory boards. So having a mixed portfolio is where the market is at, and I would say that it would be really common for advisory boards being 30 to 50% of a portfolio as being the right kind of mix of where people are balancing advisory boards with consulting, with non-executive director roles, with investment and doing other things. So I think 30 to 50% is where the market is today. If anyone has any questions or any feedback on their own portfolio that's participating today, please add it into the Q&A box. Engagement. So this is where I think we need to look at rates in where it's relative to where people are working in the market. 25% of the people within this particular survey were working in the startup and scale-up market, or what we call the micro business sector. Then you get the small and medium-sized business sector, which is 47% of the participants working in the small and medium-sized business sector. So that's the lion's share of where that $2,000 or $2,000 to $3,500 market rate for a half a day really fits. Interestingly, the larger end of town equals 25% of engagements, but it's spread between large business, corporate, not-for-profit, and government and other. So 25, 47, 25 is really an interesting ways of where advisory board professionals are engaging in the market and in different markets. Now, because of that range, we have added into this report this year rate markers. So rate markers is where, as an advisory board professional, you might say, who do I align myself in the market with? So my rate, when I look at it, I'll look at the annual engagement and rates report, but I'll also look into my own market of where I think some other profession is aligned to how I am positioned in the market. Now, 24% of the participants really align themselves with someone who's charging themselves out as a specialist consultant, 22% with a partner of a mid-tier professional services firm, and then 20% equally between a non-executive director and a business coach and mentor. So how you position yourself and your rates as a non-executive director is really different to your rates that you have potentially as a business coach or mentor. So this is showing us the variability of the advisory board profession. And when we look at the rates, we've got to put it into context as to where you are personally positioning yourself in the market. But also, if you're a business owner on the call today, what kind of specialisation are you looking for to actually understand the rate parity of how an advisor is charging for their services to sit on your advisory board? We look at professional indemnity insurance, which is why we called James in to be on this call, is that we see that about 65% of advisory board professionals have a standard professional indemnity cover. 10% have a mixed cover to cover their full portfolio of a mix of advisory and consulting. And we're seeing a large number at 25% for saying, I'm going to wing it and not have any cover at all. Now, it's not for me to judge whether that's the right thing to do or not, but it's problematic not having professional indemnity insurance, and there are consequences for any decision that we make as an advisory board professional. So we'll cover off on that and what is known as a hard market within the report itself. We'll explore that in a moment with James. We also had the opportunity to analyse the benefits of being part of a professional advisory board community. And this result has been consistent since we started this report 5 years ago, that the most valued part of being part of a professional body is having access to best practice methodology, ongoing professional development, and access to opportunities and the network. So it's really great to see that best practice matters. And as this sector matures and the market rates mature, we're seeing that the best practice will increase in its importance as well, especially as we move into greater complexity around regulations for advisory boards. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen there so I can get to have a good chat with both Michael and James. Michael, I'm going to start with you, if I may.
Certainly.
Feedback on the market rates. What is that information like when you see it, and from what you see in the market generally?
Yes, well, certainly I've been using the 2,000 half day rate, so it's been good to see that that's kind of is a bit of a median, and I don't tend to find too much pushback at that level certainly from the SME market. One of the things that I certainly do see though, and we have used, and I do coach my boards on, is that often you'll pay more, and it's worth paying more when you're bringing somebody in who adds quite a specialist amount of value. So I think the highest amount any of the boards I've worked on has paid has been $5,000 for a half day, or effectively it was a $20,000 for 4 quarterly meetings for a year, for someone who had quite specialist knowledge of a market and contacts, etc. And the client really didn't blink at that in terms of the amount of value that person was going to bring. And actually, they were even quite surprised that somebody like that would be prepared to give their time up for $20,000. which I think many SMEs do actually find that quite surprising, particularly some of the younger entrepreneurs in those scale-ups and startups that we talk of, who are sort of like, wow, that's amazing that there are people out there who are actually prepared to come and help and give those years of experience and share their contacts. And so I haven't really found a lot of pushback when you're able to demonstrate the value. So the range, I think, fits fairly comfortably. The 2,000 half day for if you're the chair, being the specialist who's running it, with more generalist approach and using the best practice methodologies and that sort of training. And then you can have higher rates for those advisors out there who maybe have very specialist skills and they have a niche that they can play to. Can certainly ask for much higher rates.
Thanks, Michael. In the report itself, we go into a bit of depth around retainers. When you are working through a proposed approach with a business, do you talk about hourly, half-day rates or a retainer? What's the language that you mainly use?
Well, I do use the half-day rate, because most of the meetings, when you are running a session, if you're going out to do it, it predominantly is something in the order of 3 hours. So even when I'm just going out there and in between the board meetings, it still ends up being 3 hours. You might have the intent to do a bit less, so half-day rate I think works. But then the conversation often is, well, here's what that looks like over a year, and it's a monthly split. And then there probably will be reference there to it being a monthly retainer, even if sometimes the quarterly board meetings are a little bit more because they may be a whole day, and then in between it might be half days. And then that gets converted into a monthly retainer.
Right. And that includes preparation as well, Michael?
Yes. Yeah. So kind of as part of the proposal, you talk about this. So I use half-day rates in part of the conversation, so they get used to the idea of 2,000 a half day. Yeah. But then the proposal put to them is including the preparation. And then once we agree to what the year is going to look like, it's divided by 12 and it's a monthly retainer.
Yeah. For members that are on this call on Advisory Board World, you have your resources, and part of those resources you've got a draft proposal template. So make sure that you are able to download that, edit it, make sure the terms and conditions are right for you. That's a good starting point. So Michael, if I go to you again, how advisory boards work with accountants. So you've got your own practice. Where do you see the advisory board interacting with accountants, both internal and external, in and around those relationships?
Yeah, so most of the boards that I'm sitting on tend to have they're of the size where they have an internal accountant of some level, bookkeeper, accountant, who is, I guess, fairly heavily involved, particularly with the chair, in getting the information ready for board meetings, and for even in the mentoring that you might be working with the CEO in between time. They're putting the information together, and you do quite a bit of work with them. From an external accountant point of view, really not so much. That's probably maybe more if they have a governance board, might do a little bit more with the external accountant. But usually the external accountants working a reasonable ways in arrears with their compliance activity, whereas your internal accountants sort of giving you the current up-to-date information. There are some accountants who are a lot more involved from producing the monthly reports and so on, and then you have a bit of interaction there to make sure that the report's containing all those things that you've discussed at the board meetings, what the board is actually after from information. So you probably will provide a brief back if an external person is preparing it. But so most of the businesses I work with have somebody internally who's doing that. And the other businesses that don't have that capability are probably using us to prepare the report anyway. One of my team who actually prepare the reports for them from their financials.
Yeah, when I was chairing advisory boards, I don't do it anymore because it's perceived as a conflict of interest given my role with the Advisory Board Centre, and I miss it dearly. And I think, Michael, when I was chairing advisory boards in my own portfolio, that's how I connected in with you in the first place. But when I was establishing the advisory board, I always made sure that I connected in with the service providers for the business to ensure that there was like an ecosystem, a collaborative network of supporters around them, rather than different providers providing fighting for airplay or trying to compete rather than everyone supporting a business. Have you seen that in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, particularly, and one that's particularly at the moment is the HR providers, because there's lots of upheaval. A lot of the conversations at the moment around people looking for, trying to keep staff and talent, pay rises, bonuses. There's lots of conversations around that. So we're finding in particular at the moment, the HR people and I guess their accountants or internal accounts becoming a very important part of supporting some of those board conversations, because a lot of those conversations are around quite tricky issues from time to time, and the HR one's just an example. I mean, I guess at any given time, there are supporters across the ecosystem that are really important to support the CEO and the management team to make good decisions, and having the advisory board being supportive of that is, I guess, crucial. So the CEO knows they've got the support of all sides, and the advisory board being up to date with what's actually happening in the business and some of those decisions. But certainly seeing a lot more from the HR teams being involved, and they're actually attending a few more of the advisory board meetings as guests the last few months, I've found.
Yeah. And that's just really to navigate that volatility that sits around that.
Yeah.
Interesting about the flexibility that you have around those advisory board structures as well. So if I come back to you, Michael, about how and when you benchmark your own rates, do you do that like as an annual review process, or do you do it on a ad hoc basis when you've got a new proposal? How do you review your own rates?
So from the actual rate point of view, I do actually lean quite a bit on the rate report that the advisory board centre produces to make sure that we're staying relevant. Plus also talking to peers, so other chairs when we do get together, what they're doing, just getting some feedback to see what's happening in the market. In many respects, the annual process is probably a little bit more around the scoping of the engagement. I tend to find the bigger piece is getting the scope right. So the rate, so having your 2,000 half-day rate, I didn't change that this year. So I'm one of those who can say that it's consistent, that it hasn't changed. I didn't change. It was probably more important for me in some of the engagements getting the scope right, because we were doing probably a bit more work in between time on some engagements, and just making sure that we had that scoped into the proposals. Often you'll start your first year of the engagement, you're taking a bit of a guess. You don't really know what's going to be like working with the CEO, how much time they're going to consume, other meetings, are you going to be able to get done what you need to get done in the time frame? Whereas year two, you've now got some data. Often the rescoping conversation in your proposal becomes the bigger piece of the price change, if that makes sense, rather than just a rate. So you might have been charging, $2,000 a month for the year, but it might end up needing to be 2.5 or 3, given what the client actually needs.
And how they're using you.
Yeah. So the dollar rate, hourly rate, or half-day rate doesn't change, but they're using you differently than you thought they would. And that's just fairly natural, because I guess both parties go into it sort of not knowing how it's going to all work each time you start that new relationship. Yeah,
which is where that scoping process is really important, to know what's in and what they're looking for and what they're not looking for in that.
Yeah, and making sure everyone's on that same page, because I think you can get some of that. I mean, some conflict might be the wrong word, but a little bit of friction if you're not clear on, if both parties are not clear. So if they think you're doing more than what you think you're doing, you can get you may get some dissatisfaction there. So that scoping conversation up front and being very clear on what it is you are doing and making sure that fits with what they want is a pretty important part of the process.
Yeah. So for those of you that are certified chairs on the call today, the board starter program, which normally, as you know, takes 3 months to establish an advisory board, be probably a good approach is to quote for that. And at the end of that period, you know what you're dealing with. And then you could re-quote for the structure that you're implementing for the longer term. So maybe good to stage that out, because in that, like you said, in the first year, you don't know up front, but if you bring that to your first 3 months, then you know what you're dealing with.
From that program, I did. That's one of the things that we have changed. That we now have the 90-day program. Right. So we do that before we do the next piece now, which, early days we weren't doing that, and we probably got caught out more. So from the new ones, we've only had a couple starts so far, but we've started with a 90-day, and here's the price, and we use the tools, etc., to help us to scope out what it is, where the client's at, what they need, what the state of their system is. Yeah. And that's been really helpful so far for the couple of clients we've done that with. Gives everybody a much clearer understanding of how much work there is to be done.
Yeah, that's great. You're not locked in for that 12 months before you can review it again. Yeah, no. That's great. Yeah, thanks for that insight, Michael. James, over to you. The insurance industry, the report, and in our research, we had a really good research meeting together, was described as being a hard market. What does a hard market mean?
A hard market means that insurance premiums are going up, capacity is reduced, so it's harder to get cover, and the covers that usually you can get will often be with higher excesses or some sort of reduced limits of cover. The hard market, whilst it has some minor part to do with COVID, it all started probably back in 2018-19, when Lloyd's, who probably sit behind a large part of the market in one format or another, went through all their portfolios, and anything that was making losses decided that it was either time to put up prices or exit the market. So what's happened is capacity has been reduced significantly around through the insurers. Many insurers have exited, whilst they haven't exited a particular, they haven't exited completely, they've exited particular classes of a market. And that's put extra strain on the insurers that are in the market in that portfolio. But at the same time, the capacity is low and prices are going up according to that. Part of the scenario is that insurers actually make most of their money on investment income. COVID, as we know, reduced interest rates down to significant and lows that have never been before. So insurance companies have very little investment income coming in. So therefore, with reduced capacity and the scenario of interest rates being low, the only thing to do was to raise rates, premiums, to cover off that particular scenario. So I've been in the industry 35 years, and my guess is that it's probably the hardest 2.5 years that I've seen in the market in all that time. And as I say, whilst it was slightly around COVID, the majority has been the reduced capacity that was already starting well and truly prior to COVID occurring. In the PI space, we're seeing increases generally of 20 to 30%. Management liability to directors and officers, probably fairly similar. Property prices and going through what I'll call going through the roof because of our own conditions around floods. And then cyber, there is just so many different cyber attacks happening along the way that cyber's actually becoming quite difficult to get. And if you do get it, it's actually relatively dear in the market. So we're seeing a very, very volatile market at the moment, and we're probably in the majority of our larger clients, they're all saying, why are my premiums going up? What's happened? Why is this happening? Or the excess has gone up from 5,000 to 10,000 or from 10,000 to 20,000. So we're seeing a lot of this, and then you've got to sit down and show them the way the portfolios are running within the insurers, giving them some examples. and then explaining to them that it's market conditions, not their particular business, and it's not being targeted directly against them. It is across the board. As far as advisory board members, we've managed to do a standard professional indemnity public liability type policy. And this is just for your standard advisory board member that we see as a high level business coach, mentor, advisor. And that's relatively good, and I'll say even cheap, around about the $750 mark for a year. And it's based on levels of revenue in. But then what we do see is that advisory board members are mostly evolving to being advisors, consultants, and perhaps even going on to boards and even consulting on mergers and acquisitions. So that then takes a whole range of complexities into account. And what we do where we have those sorts of inquiries, we are making, working with the advisory board member to see how we can best get them covered off. So it's actually been, it's been a couple of years that I would like to put behind me because it has been so volatile, and then COVID's thrown some extra problems in there. But the industry itself has just been really difficult to deal with as far as pricing, coverage, conditions, excesses, and if we can get cover. So some of the insurers are throwing out what we would consider really good business. They might have had it for 10 years without a claim, but they're just not prepared to offer cover because they're exiting that portfolio. So let's watch this space for the next couple of years, and hopefully enough, my hair will go from grey back to being black again.
I don't think we can turn back time, but I'll give it a go. It is interesting when we're looking at, say, most commonly advisory boards are worth 30 to 50% of a broader portfolio. So they're doing those other things, consulting, non-exec director, doing pro bono work. But we're seeing that from the experience so far that only about 10% of advisory board professionals have got a blended cover of advisor and consulting. So what would your advice be, James? Do people need to go back and have a look at the wording of their policy?
Oh, most definitely. Now, this is the experience that we've put in there is only the inquiries that we're getting. So, you know, someone like a Michael, or someone that's an accountant, or someone that's a legal advisor is probably covered off by a corporate overall arching policy anyway, that would cover off this particular scenario. There is one other scenario that we haven't touched on, and that's where someone's working on an advisory board and they've actually managed to get cover for themselves under the corporate entity that they're working for, whether that be a formal board that then and their insurer agrees to cover advisory boards. So the stats that you've put in is only really the inquiries that we're receiving, and how I see those inquiries panning out, that whether we actually write cover under the standard professional indemnity, whether we don't write any because they decide not to take it, or they're actually doing a blend of consulting and advisory board work. So it's a big mixture, but I think probably more so that, yes, we're always happy to look at any scenarios. We had one advisory board member that was going on to become a director of a not-for-profit. This was a little while ago. We've got his professional indemnity cover, but he said, would you be able to look at the coverage of the not-for-profit to see if there's any gaps that you can think of? More than happy to do that at any time. So I just gave him a bit of, I can't call it free advice because we did, but it was, in so much as we looked at the policy that the not-for-profit held, and it was specifically covering directors, and advisory board members. So that all appeared to be quite okay. So yes, devil's in the detail as always. And in those particular situations, more than happy to look at anybody's policy and give them some thoughts, play devil's advocate, whether they agree or disagree, but play devil's advocate on how the coverage might apply or not apply to them.
Okay, thank you. And for international markets, there are some contacts on Advisory Board World. So we're just talking about Australia at the moment.
Correct.
Yeah, James, that's right. And so there are contacts for other jurisdictions as well to gain support. Thank you for that, James. If I just look at some questions that have come in we've got one here from Monique. Given that scope can shift in your engagements, is it preferable to promote your retainer model rather than half day or a daily rate? I'll hand that one over to you, Michael. What do you think?
Yeah, look, I think whichever way you go, ultimately you're working out some version of scope. So if it's like I use the language around the half day, but ultimately it is a retainer model. And I've just used that half day rate to try and calculate the amount of time commitment that I think's in it. I think some of the things that I've learned to do a little better than I probably was doing now is having those conversations earlier if it looks like you're having some scope creep. So even if it's a retainer model and you're saying, look, that retainer covers X number of hours or whatever it is, when it's becoming clear that that's, I guess, being breached, then having that conversation earlier around how you want to deal with that with the business owner is important. So even if it's a retainer, you can sit there and go, hey, we kind of agreed to 5 hours a month, we're using 7. How do you want to go? Do you want to trim up some of the back end? Do we really want to, or should we just increase the retainer? So I think it's as much as anything, it's just managing those using the scope to manage the expectations and have the conversation as early as possible when what you've committed to do is being extended.
It's interesting too, if an advisory board is not working or it's reached its end, is the way to finish an agreement. I think that's also an interesting space. We say to business owners when they're scoping out their advisory board, if it's not working for you, you need to be able to cut it. So because you're not there to prove a point, either side of the equation, or if the job is done. So just be really careful, I think, around the terms of keep the terms really simple, but keep them really clear as well. Thanks for that, Monique. Hopefully that was helpful. Lorna in Canada, good to have you here. This one will be for you, James. The advisory board I serve on currently provides PI insurance. What is your view of this coverage versus my own personal PI coverage?
Because I'm only based in Australia, I can only give you some general thoughts around Australia, and I would presume the Canadian market will be fairly similar. So the professional indemnity insurance provided by the company, and whatever that might be, normally covers the vicarious liability of anybody that's involved as a contractor anyway. This is the Australian market. It's where a third party, whether that be a provider to the company that you're working for, or the insurer themselves decides that they want to take action against the advisors. So, for example, I'm working on an advisory board, and somewhere there's a claim against the business for the work that I've done. So the business is covered for that particular scenario, and the insurer might pay out in that particular scenario. However, they may pursue you in the context of being an advisor and third-party contractor, or there might be someone else that pursues you in your own right, and there may or may not be coverage under the corporate entity's policy. So it's often misunderstood where, yes, the cover's there under what we call vicarious liability. However, does that stop someone else taking action directly against you? And no, it doesn't. And if you're not 100% clear on the cover that is being provided by the company, you could be that you're actually out on your own if you get named personally in an action. That's just a general thought and general overview on the way the Australian market works. And I think Canada would probably be fairly similar.
Thank you. Hopefully that was helpful for you, Lorna. I'll just make a note around this, around informal sort of appointments. 2 weeks ago, it was published that an advisor was supporting a startup with non-payment, and the relationship disintegrated during that time. And then the business said, we're not needing you anymore. That was done all pro bono work. That advisor was helping them with not just advice, but actually providing market leads, filed a claim for unfair dismissal and won against the startup. So these informal relationships, you've got to be really careful about the way that those engagements actually work for both sides of the equation, I think. Paul, you've got a question here, so thank you for that. In the engagement slide, it shows small business, medium size and large, give an indication of the revenue turnover. Generally, the micro business or startup is generally pre-revenue to 1.5 million. Small business is 1.5 to 10. Medium businesses 10 to 100 million, and then corporate 100 million plus. They're the kind of markers that we use for those classifications, Paul. Thanks, Lorna. That was so helpful. So thank you for those questions. If there's any more questions coming through, but while we do a bit of a wrap up, Michael, I'm going to start with you. Any last tips that you might have for participants today in regards to the way that they're engaging with the market?
Yeah, I guess for the advisors in the audience, I guess don't be scared to put forward a rate that reflects your value. If you're bringing something unique to the table, your clients will certainly value that. I do see some advisors maybe undervalue themselves a little. So I think that's really important. And often your client or the small business owner, and even this is for small business owners, have a budget for what you're prepared to spend on your advisory board, like anything else. And sometimes you might decide, you know what, I'm happy to pay $5,000 of my budget for this advisor who's giving me really specific stuff. But it might mean for now I'm better off with a 2 advisor board rather than a 3. It's about making sure that you get what it is that you're needing to support your business for the amount of money you can afford. So having that budget, but then splitting it the right way. Sometimes it's better to pay one person more and just have less people than it is to have lots of people all at $2,000 a half day, and you might not quite get what you're after. But the same thing goes for the advisors. If you're the $5,000 guy and you should be asking for it, then you should ask for it.
Yeah, so know your value. Those rate markers are an important exercise to do. Thanks, Michael. James, any last tips for attendees?
Yeah, well, I always think the devil's in the detail of coverage, and where your and advisory board members are often specialists in a particular area, and whether it be IT or whether it be manufacturing or whatever. So they have the knowledge. Insurance is a very specialised field, and it takes a lot of reading to look at the nuances of the way each insurer responds to a particular scenario. So what I suggest is that if anybody's got any queries about the way they've got cover at the moment, more than happy to do a review for them. This is all, I'll call it on a pro bono basis, and without expectation of ever having any business or anything out of it, because I can provide some just general guidance as to what they think they've got cover for and what I believe they actually have cover for. And there may be some big or vast differences. The other thing is that what we see is working as an advisory board member and then crossing over to being consulting. And it's often not what the advisory board member believes they're doing, but it's what maybe the accusation comes in later. A bit like you were talking about that one just a moment ago where someone was doing pro bono work, and they were helping them. And then ultimately something changed. The relationship went pear-shaped, and that's when the time comes that you actually know whether your insurance is actually valid or not. As I said, I'm more than happy to work with anybody just to look at what they're doing and see if the current coverage that they've got is fit for purpose.
Thanks, James. Well, Michael and James, thank you for sharing your market insights today. It's very, very valuable. And for our members, remember to download the report off the site. And I hope this has been useful for you, and look forward to seeing you at future events. Thanks, Michael and James. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, you.
Louise.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for being here.
Have a great day. Bye.